Game over. Game over. Lights out. You've just been completely obliterated publicly with
Cool.
your wait. You've been caught. You've been folded like a chair, caught with your pants down.
Take this ontological argument and present it to you, and then we can debate on this if you would like. The argument is that we are all contingent existences because we have dependencies and we depend on something.
Hmm.
And there is a disparity between our essence and existence. For a contingent existence to exist, there has to be some kind of an absolute existence. Otherwise, we will be looking into this idea of infinite regress, which
Mm-hmm.
has certain issues, in my opinion,
Mm-mm.
because an infinite regress will still be a dependent existence, and a dependent existence would require something. If it's cyclic in nature, then that set of cyclic contingencies cannot exist because that would be a fallacy, and I can prove later why. So my
Mm.
overall argument is, and happy to debate on this, for dependent existences to exist, there has to be a foundational existence which was always existing, which never did not exist. So it was an
Mm.
absolute existence always existing.
Okay, so when you say that infinite regress of contingent dependencies is problematic, are you saying that's problematic in virtue of the fact that it's unintuitive? It's problematic in virtue of the fact that it's logically impossible, or
I would
either of
say
those
that
two
it's
things?
Yeah, I would say both, but I would say logically impossible because it's hard for me to wrap my head around something which is dependent on something. For instance, A is a contingent existence, it's dependent on something.
Mm-hmm.
How did that something come into existence? There has to have some kind of an absolute existence.
Well, you
Why?
keep reasserting that they're okay. JJ, stop chiming in.
Sorry.
Okay.
Nope.
So when you say there has to be an absolute existence, right? When you posit that there has to be an absolute existence, that's already presupposing that there isn't an infinite regress of contingent dependencies, right? So if you're saying that's logically impossible, like first, like I would ask you to demonstrate what the contradiction is, and second, like I can just give you multiple examples of things that do begin to exist within a sequence, but there's no first member within the sequence, right? So imagine if you had, um, let's say, like a chain of electrical currents that derive their energy from each other. Let's say, in order for B to charge C, um, B would have already have to exist in order to charge C. In order for C to charge D, C already would have to exist in order to charge D, and it goes ad infinitum, right? Are you positing, first of all, are you positing that in particular circular dependencies are logically impossible, or are you positing merely that all infinite regresses of what any form that it take are logically impossible? Right.
I would argue both. So I'll explain why cyclical is
Okay,
impossible.
explain.
Because, so for instance, cyclical, A is equal to B is equal to C, and C is equal to A again, right? So that means B and C did not exist, it was just A all around. So cyclical nature is kind of impossible because that means it was just A, which was always existing. Uh, the second thing is existence, contingent existence within itself. So you just gave an example of charged particles, right? For that to exist, if you look into law of conservation of energy, it has to have some kind of a contingency for it to some kind of dependency for it to exist. Whatever the initial charge was, it has to have some kind of dependency. Now it can go in a cyclical nature for sure, but it has to have some kind of a dependent existence, and that cyclical nature
But
is also limited.
why? You see, what when you say it has to, that claim already assumes that if we were to assume the negation in this sense, it would be a contradiction to say that the initial, let's say, electrical current doesn't have a cause. But what's the contradiction in saying that the initial current began to exist, but it doesn't have a cause, right?
Yeah, so the problem over here is that it is dependent by definition. It's not independent. And when it's dependent on something,
No, but we're
that
not positing. But look, we're not positing. We're not saying either way if it's dependent or independent. We're
sure
positing that the first member, right, within the set of
just came
all of
into
these. Yes,
yeah.
it
So the first member,
explains.
how did
Sorry,
it exist?
sorry, sorry. It explains all of the other contingencies, but that initial member doesn't have a cause. What's the incoherency?
So if the initial member does not have a cause, then it's an absolute existence. That's
That
the
doesn't
the issue.
follow. That doesn't
No, no,
follow.
no.
And let me show you
So
why.
so
Right.
basically, what
Hold, hold.
I'll kind of yeah. Just give me 1 second. So you're saying that there is some kind of a if it's not an absolute existence, you're saying that there's some kind of a dependent existence which just came into existence without a cause.
Yeah. Let's say that the initial. Let's even put this at like a time interval. Let's say that there's a first instance within time, right? Time began, but it doesn't have a prior cause because there's nothing prior to that first moment by definition. What exactly is the incoherency in positing such a state of affairs?
So when time began, it has to have some kind of a cause because it cannot, and I'll explain why. Because it has to be dependent on something. So time in the universe began with singularity or with the Big Bang, at which things started, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, how did that singularity or Big Bang happen? Uh, that's the
You're
issue at hand.
presuming you're presuming that the first instance within time couldn't have been a brute contingency, but then again, when we ask you why, what's the argument for why it's logically impossible for something to begin to exist? In this case, a first instance within time without a prior cause. You just say, "Oh, because it has to be dependent on
No,
something
no, no. That's
independent
not what I'm
that
saying.
explains it."
So,
Well, you
so
just
what
Yeah,
I'm
said that
doing
you
it
here,
had
pointed
to
you
had a cause because it's dependent,
and you
yeah,
right?
I'm saying that so I'm saying when you add the word brute to a dependent existence and you say brute contingencies, you're kind of supposing that we don't know, but somehow this thing happened. And the way I'm tackling this situation is that I'm telling you, yes, we don't know because there is foundational existence which existed, which led to the existence of a dependent existence. The word brute over there means that you don't know, but
No, no,
somehow
no.
the chain started.
Brute doesn't. Brute just says that it just has no explanation, right? So
Exactly.
why would we why would yeah? So why would we have to posit that there's a first moment that has to be explained by an independent reality when I mean,
Because a
even
dependent
admittedly, it doesn't appear, sorry, it doesn't appear that you're making the claim that it's logically impossible for there to be a brute contingency, such as a first moment within time that doesn't have a prior cause.
Yeah, so the reasoning that I'm giving over here is that a dependent existence by nature cannot exist without an independent cause. If it did exist without an independent cause, then that wouldn't be a dependent existence. For a dependent
No,
existence to
but we're not
exist, it has
positing that's dependent.
that's a
Look,
circular.
but
That's
we're
so
not
circular.
positing. Look. There might be an equivocation. There might be
sure.
not an equivocation. There might be like some misunderstanding here of how I'm using contingent. But when I'm saying that's contingent, I said I'm using it in the modal sense that it can be otherwise, right? Um, that the proposition in question, neither is it the case that um, the proposition contains a contradiction, nor does its negation contain a contradiction. At least I mean logically contingent, right? So I'm saying you could posit a first moment within time, right, as like a brute contingency, but um, by definition, if it's brute, there's no antecedent condition. There's nothing prior to that that would explain the first moment, right? Because no one would know what it would mean to even say prior to the first moment or prior to time, because saying that something is prior to time would just be incoherent, right? Like prior is already a temporal notion. You would agree with that.
So here's the thing over here. I'm not viewing this from a temporal lens. What I'm viewing this is from a dependency lens. What I'm trying to say over here is that dependent existences, if they occur through some kind of a brute fashion, that wouldn't be logical, because it has to be dependent from, and you can look at it from a modal lens as well. But it has to be, because it has to be dependent on something. Now, if there is foundational existence already in play, then that foundational existence can give rise to a dependent existence. That foundational existence never did not exist, because it's foundational. It's ever
Yeah, by
existing. It was,
definition. Yeah, it's
yes.
analytically true that never began to exist. But what I'm tackling
So
is this.
yes,
Wait, wait. What I'm tackling is this like weird notion that you seem to be having where you're trying to assume that if there's an initial state, right, within time, and we might not even say that it's an eternal state or anything. We're saying that's a we're saying that's a finite state where time began, but we don't posit a cause. You keep saying, well, that can't be the case because there has to be a foundational existence that would have
yeah, I
to
mean,
that would have to explain that because that initial state would have to be dependent. But how does it follow that because let's say this initial state is finite, that therefore it would have to be dependent on something else for its existence? Because we can agree if the initial state is dependent, yeah, it would have to depend upon something. But I'm not positing that the initial state is dependent, right? I'm not positing that at all. I'm saying that there is an initial state within time, but it doesn't have a cause. Now, you might object and say that's nomologically impossible. That's impossible given the laws of nature, right? But certainly, there's no good reason to believe that that's a logical contradiction because you haven't established how it would be.
yeah. So here's the thing. You're saying that somehow we have a contingent existence that came into existence without a cause,
Yeah.
and that basically started the chain of events for contingent existences.
Yes.
That may
My
not be the case.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to tell you is that first existence, A, if it's not foundational in nature, then it's dependent on something to exist. Because I cannot. Think of it from
Are you
from a
just saying
logical lens.
foundational? Or are you just saying foundational? Because if you define, we got to be tricky here, but with our
Sure.
words, if you're defining foundational as not beginning to exist,
So foundational,
then
I
no,
mean that it
then
does not depend on something to exist. That's what I'm trying to say.
okay, so then if you're operating by that definition, then sure. What my view doesn't, then that would be foundational because it's that there's no first moment that there's no first moment in which the first moment is dependent on something prior to the first moment. There is no nothing prior to the first moment, right? So it doesn't the first moment doesn't depend upon anything. Right. So if we're operating on that definition, then sure, you could say that would be foundational. But if you mean didn't begin to exist, then no. Right. If what you mean by foundational is didn't begin to exist, then no. That then my view isn't positing um, like a foundational existence.
Sure. So what and it has to always exist, because if it ceases to exist, it kind of indicates its contingency, and then that
Well,
means that it cannot be
how
foundational.
does that
So
follow? Right? Because number
so
one, then you're just gonna either you're gonna add in some qualifier
no,
to
no, no, I'm not adding the qual.
what a sorry, you're gonna add in a qualifier to what could be considered foundational, right? In which case you would have to provide an argument that foundational both would have to require that it didn't begin to exist, and that not only that it didn't begin to exist, but it can't cease to exist either, because there's a difference between something obviously being beginningless and endless, right? You're saying it's both beginningless and endless. Well, I could
That's correct.
accept.
For the chain of contingencies to exist, it has to be both beginningless and endless. And I'll explain why. For some chain of event to kind of exist, you and if you make the argument that there is an uncaused cause which led to some kind of a contingent existence, but then that existence kind of ceased to exist.
Mhm.
What that is telling me is that this has some kind of dependency. Otherwise, it wouldn't have existed. That's what it's
No,
telling me.
how does that
So there are
follow?
two issues over here, two issues at hand. Firstly, the uncaused cause thing is illogical. For something that will cease to exist cannot just come into existence.
Wait,
Yeah,
but
you're
that's
just
just
assuming that. You're not
reasserting. Yeah,
actually
but that's
making
just
that argument.
reasserting. That's just reasserting what it would mean for it to be
So
Yeah,
foundational
he's
for your
reasserted
view.
can
But
that
you
like four
obviously,
or
I
five
don't.
times.
Oh my
no 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 I,
God!
no can
Just
you explain?
people. Just keep this between me and him, right? That
Yeah,
is just
Darth, can you explain?
reasserting what I said from the outset, that while I can agree with you that whatever is foundational doesn't depend upon anything else for its existence, how does it follow from that that it would have to also not cease to exist in order for it to be foundational, right? Because I'm accepting the beginningless part, but when you argue for the endless part, you're just somehow sneaking in the assumption that if it were to cease to exist, that would be indicatory. That would indicate that um, it wouldn't be foundational because all the other things that are non-foundational also cease to exist. But what? I mean, that's just like obviously that's a
So
non sequitur, right?
I'll explain to you why. Because whatever that is contingent is kind of made up of parts, right? Would agree to that?
Whatever is contingent is made out of parts. Well,
So
like I mean,
it has
given our empirical observations, maybe I would agree with that. But I mean, you could imagine things that are immaterial but are also contingent, right?
sure.
If what you mean by no parts is like possessing no physical parts,
No,
well
no,
then no. There could be things that have no physical parts but are still contingent, right?
sure. So what I mean over here is there are two things which I think kind of defy logic. Firstly, for a foundational existence to exist and be dependent on something, I feel is problematic, because if it's not endless, then that means it's not foundational. You
That
know what I mean?
no, I don't know what you mean, right? Because I'm already
So
accepting. Look, I'm already accepting that it's beginningless,
no, I'm telling
right?
you. Firstly, I'll explain what the definition of foundational existence is. Foundational existence is basically always existing because it has to somehow account for all the contingent existences.
Okay.
Because otherwise, it would be illogical
No,
to say that somehow something came into existence
no,
and
no,
then the
no.
chain of events stopped.
Wait. Hold on there. Hold on there. Um, See, when I define it as being beginningless, in the sense that it wasn't dependent upon anything external from it in order to explain its existence, but nevertheless it gave rise to the rest of contingent reality. How does it follow from that that if it were to be let's say a foundational being under your view,
Then
that
that means
if it's
yes.
sorry
My bad.
that
So sorry.
if it's not if it's not endless, that therefore it doesn't have the attributes of being a foundational being. What you need to do is to make an argument that um, it's constitutive of a foundational being, that it has the essential property of being endless, right?
Sure. I'll do
Whereas
that.
in all,
I'll,
what I mean by an essential property here, in my own words, is that if it were not to have this property, it wouldn't be characterized as the type of being it is anymore,
sure.
right? So that property, in order for that being to exist, that property would have to be possessed by that being, in all possible
Yeah.
worlds,
So
right?
I'll
But
address
how
that.
do you
That's a very
establish
good
that
point, George.
it has to exist in all possible worlds?
Yeah. So that's a very good point. So when you mentioned foundational existence, and you said that that somehow started this chain of events, I don't mean foundational existence in that sense. What I mean is that a foundational existence is an existence which cannot cease to exist because it was always existing. I'll take your point. Just give me 1 second.
Yeah,
Because
effectively,
if
you're saying energy is exactly that.
so,
I mean,
we'll
energy at its
come on to the
fundamental
material world as
particles.
well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm just saying
yeah.
energy at its fundamental particles consistently vibrates zero point energy. We know that where you have this particular mass, which obviously, if it's condensed into a small area, I'm not saying Big Bang, but a very tight or a smaller compact of fundamental elements that are interacting with each other at a high temperature, that's energy. Now we're talking about almost an infinite energy, I would say. And then obviously that created the expansion, which then brought into being obviously the Higgs field, the Higgs bosons, the bosons to the quarks, so on, so on. Why does that you might say cosmic soup, which is constantly moving, which has energy all the time, is fundamentally the start. And it, depending on the laws of how that works, maybe when it gets to a zero point energy, as it's, we're getting colder in the universe, then it reverses itself. We don't know that. It's still a question mark.
Sure, sure.
That's what I'm trying to
That's
get at.
Michael, a very good point. So I'll address the
It's a
energy part as well.
propagate.
Uh, just give me 1 second. So I'll address the energy part as well, because that's another debate whether energy existed before singularity and the Big Bang. But that's a good point that you raised. But I'll address Darth's point. So Darth, what I'm trying to say over here is that a foundational existence, its very essence is its existence. So for contingent existences, there is a disparity between existence and essence, right? So the the part that it's a foundational existence means that it cannot not exist, because if it did, that would be a fallacy. So
Wait,
and
wait,
and
wait, wait,
all
wait.
contingent,
If it
I
cannot
just give
not
me 1 second.
exist, it's a fallacy. Let me just stop you right there.
Sure.
When you say it's foundational but it cannot not exist, it's a fallacy. What fallacies are you pertaining to? Are you referring to?
So what I'm trying,
Right? Do you mean that it's just analytically false that it
no,
cannot
no, no,
not exist?
logically,
I'm
yes.
just going to reject that because I already told
I'll
you what my
explain to you
view was.
why. I'll explain to you why that's not true. Why that's a logical fallacy. Because if you have a foundational existence, it was always existing, right?
Again, that's
No, no,
just
no. Hear me out.
repetition of the claim, right? What we're
Yeah,
asking is an argument that establishes
I'll tell
that
you. I'll
it's
tell you
essential.
because we believe that all contingencies are a formulation or somehow part of that absolute existence. So it's just like pretty much light, which kind of emanates, and everything is in its existence. Now I'll explain why. Now, for instance, Darth, your very essence and existence are two separate things. What Darth is, whether he goes to college as a professor, is very distinct whether with the fact that Darth exists or not. This is a very subtle point and has a bit of nuance. So what I'm trying to say is that the foundational existence, there is no disparity between existence and essence. Its very essence is its existence, and its existence is its essence. And this is not metaphysical. This is pretty
Yeah,
much
so
very much
you're just
logical.
invoking that God's existence is identical to His essence. Yeah, I've
It-
been
it-
here before. Yeah, I've
sure.
looked into Thomas
So I
Aquinas
made two
and the
claims. So I
wise
made two.
Pyrrhac. But what? Let me
So I
just
made
ask
two
you
interesting
this:
claims. Yes,
you're
please.
just defining, wait, hold on, you're just defining that it's a particular characteristic of a foundational being that its essence has to be identical to its existence. But how do you establish that's an essential property, right? Not just the fact that you're merely defining its existence identical to its essence. Because if it's just an analytic claim that you're making, well, I mean, I could make an analytic claim for my view, right? But at least I've provided an argument for why I think it doesn't logically entail that because it's beginningless, it would therefore follow that it would be endless. Now, what you're trying to say is that since um, foundational existences would have to explain the rest of reality, that would have to carry on the characteristic of not ceasing to exist. But if it began to exist and
It
ceases
didn't
to,
begin to exist. It
no,
was always existing.
sorry. If it began to exist and it somehow cause the rest of of all the rest of the contingent existences to exist, how would that entail that it would be somewhat impossible for it to cease to exist? Well, you're just going to repeat the claim that's just analytically false that a foundational being can cease to exist. But that's the thing in contention. You haven't provided an argument that established the conclusion. You gave me Thomas Aquinas's view that God's existence is identical to his essence, but again, that's just that. To me, if you're making an analytic claim for that, then it's not going to be
No, no, I'm not
informative,
making an analytic
right?
claim. I'm making,
Oh,
I'm
say
making,
so. It's a synthetic claim then,
no, no, no.
right?
Yes. So what I'm trying to
Okay.
tell you over here is that your claim is that an uncaused caused, somehow a contingent existence came into existence.
Well, but
I don't
look,
know how.
if it's a synthetic claim, then you would be, then you would have
What
to
I'm trying to tell you
provide,
that there was
yeah, you would have to provide
existence.
some a
Yes, yes. I'm
posteriori. Sorry. You would have to provide some a posteriori. Um, you would make a knowledge claim that would have to be known under your view a posteriori for why you
sure.
think if there's a foundational existence that would have the essential property of not ceasing to exist. But then, how do you establish that a foundational being has to be synthetically identical, right, to being everlasting? That's what we're arguing. In what sense is the property of being eternal synthetically identical to being what you call it foundational, right? That's the argument that we're wanting you to provide.
Yeah. So there are two things over here. The first part is that it has a foundational existence cannot cease to exist. Part of the reason is that its formulation of contingent existences is the biggest evidence that that foundational existence cannot cease to exist, because
Wait a minute.
we
Wait. Let me. We want to clarify. I need to keep interrupting because I need
yeah,
clarification. When you
if,
mean evidence, are you saying?
sure.
When you mean evidence, are you saying that it increases the probability
No.
of
I'm
your
not saying,
thesis being true?
I'm using deduction, and I'm just using logic. So what I'm trying to tell you over
Okay.
here
So
is
what you
this is
have is a deductive proof then. So okay, then don't use evidence because I take evidence in the way that I defined it. Okay. Should go
I
on.
mean, if you, so that means you only use induction for logic, as evidence, or you just use
No.
empirical proof.
I just define evidence in the way it's colloquially defined, right? If you like
Sure.
have proprietary notion of what evidence is, I mean, go right ahead. But I'm more interested in like how you like bridge the gap between the entailment that something, if it's beginningless in nature, it would have to essentially
I'm saying
be
you
endless
cannot.
in
So
nature.
the point I'm trying to make over here is that you cannot have something which is beginningless in nature. That goes against the laws of logic, because you need to kind of tell me
Okay,
how did it come into existence.
um what law or what axiom rather, I would rather say axiom, what axiom
Sure.
within classical logic is violated by saying that there's
So
something
let's
beginningless in nature?
consider A is
And
a
what I mean
contingent.
by nature is not that
Sure,
it's
not the
in
material world. I get
nature.
your
What I
point.
mean in
I get your
essence,
point.
right?
Yes, yes. So you tell me that A is a foundational existence based on your definition.
Wait a minute.
No, no,
Wait a
just
minute.
give me 1 second.
Let me think about this for a second. Were you just making the claim just now that saying that something is beginningless in nature is violating one of the fundamental axioms? Well, let's just say fundamental axioms in classical logic. Was that your
No, no,
claim?
I never said that. What I'm trying to tell you is that if something is beginningless, it has to be foundational. That's
Something is
the
beginningless,
argument.
it has to be foundation. Okay.
Otherwise, you have to give me proof, Darth, that somehow a dependent existence or a contingent existence came into existence without an absolute
Well,
existence.
let me respond to that. For example, if you say that, and we're going by your definition of foundational, if you're saying that if something is beginningless, it has to be foundational.
And endless.
What if there's a beginningless sequence of past events that exist in the universe? Are you saying that then that beginningless sequence would have to be foundational? Because I would disagree based off of your um, definition
No, I
of
the
foundational, that
point
that
I'm
would
trying to
be
make is
predicated upon the sequence,
sure, sure. The
right?
point I'm trying to make is an absolute existence is always existing, right? It cannot not exist. You're telling me that you have an absolute existence is foundational existence, which is always existing. You're telling me your foundational existence somehow is not always existing. It just came into existence out of magic, and that started the chain of events. Is
Well,
that
no
correct?
one's saying, well, when you use words like came out of magic,
My bad. I
right?
didn't
You're
mean to say
presuming
it from
that
that
there is an
perspective. What I'm
explanation.
trying to say,
Yeah, I know it's a ridicule. Yeah, I know it's a
I
ridicule,
didn't
but
mean to
you're
ridicule. I
somehow treating,
apologize. I
you're
apologize.
somehow presuming. No, sorry, you're somehow presuming that brute, like these types of brute facts aren't going to be accepted under your model. But also, that's another thing that you never provided an argument for. You never provided an argument for why it would have to have an explanation if it began to exist, right? Because I'm presuming you're going to hold, and I don't want to get into like a long conversation about this. I'm presuming that you're of the view that um, everything has an explanation, right? Which is just to restate like the
So
what
your
the
view is that
original
that
Larmesian
things can
PSR
exist
is.
without an explanation. Is that
Sorry?
the view? What I'm trying to say is, Darth, is your view that things can exist without an explanation?
Yeah, things can exist without an explanation because presumably, what would explain God under your view,
Yeah.
right?
So
You think that God? Do you think that God is somehow
it's
like
foundational
internally
existence.
explained, or
It's
just a brute fact?
So I'm telling you, from a logical sense, it's foundational existence which has divine simplicity and attributes. But we can go to that part later on, since we're
Okay.
discussing existence right
No,
now.
don't. But I
Now,
want
no,
to
no.
state. I want to posit my point. I want to posit my
So,
point. So,
Darth, if you can just let me ask one question, and then you can answer. Thank you so
okay.
much. This has been a very enlightening conversation, and I appreciate your time as well. And my apologies, I didn't mean to ridicule in any way or form. What I'm trying to ask you is, my claim is that foundational existence always existed. It never did not exist, and that led to contingent existences. It's hard for me to reconcile that somehow a contingent existence had an uncaused cause and came into existence, which led to the chain of events. Because if that happened, that seems to be illogical because it's a dependency. Otherwise, it's not foundational in any way or form.
Again, very. I mean, restating the claim over again. So I'm gonna reply and posit some example of something that's beginningless because you said you also reasserted something else, which I found to be like at first it sounded intuitive, but then when I realized how this applies to like an infinite sequence of past events, then I realized, oh yeah, this is problematic. So let's assume, for example, that there's a beginningless sequence of all past events in the universe, right? In the sense that um, one moment can transition into another moment, into another moment, into another moment, into another moment. So there's a finite distance between the moments, but within the sequence itself, there's no first moment, there's no first member. So now I'm taking it to the other view, right, of causal infinitism and or temporal infinitism, and saying that there's no first moment, but nevertheless there's a finite distance between the moments, right? So presumably within the set, you don't start counting, right? You don't start counting, but nevertheless, you presumably can count one day from the next day, from the next day, from the next day. Um, what exactly, first of all, if you think that's incoherent, which so your argument relies on saying that's incoherent, you would have to show the contradiction. And second of all, Are you saying that in virtue of the fact that the set itself is beginningless, it would have, sorry, that this, if the set itself is beginningless, that therefore it would have to be foundational, right? Because it wouldn't
So
necessarily follow.
my argument is that a set of contingencies cannot be beginningless. So that's the point I'm trying to make.
What's
Uh,
what's what's the
no, no, no.
argument? What's the argument that's impossible?
I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Because 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 there was a time that it did not exist and it came into
No, no, no,
existence,
no, no,
right?
no, no, no.
And
Stop right there. Stop right there. The
sure,
set
sure.
itself. This is the confusion, right? The set didn't come into existence, right? And there's no first member, right? So predicating those aspects of
So how did the
beginning to
members of the
exist
set come into
by
existence?
definition wouldn't apply to a beginningless sequence. So
I
that's
understand.
that's not a
Basically,
good objection.
what your argument right now is very different from my argument. You're trying to tell me that there is no first member. Somehow
Yeah,
it's infinity and there are members in the set. My argument is, how did the members in the set come into existence? They
they
have to
come
be
into
dependent because
existence.
that would defy logic.
Sorry. I would just reply and say that for each member within the set,
Yeah.
the necessary conditions are accounted for by each prior member within the
So
set.
how did the prior
Right.
member come in?
The prior member would have to come in through the prior member.
So I'll tell you why this kind of defies the law of contradiction. You're telling me that there is a set which has dependencies, and that set of dependencies are existing without an absolute existence. That set of dependencies. So, for instance, you're telling me I'm dependent on something, and then that something is dependent on something, and that something is dependent on something, but somehow this came into existence without any kind of process,
Well, the set.
without any outside cause. I should say outside cause,
Well, the
and that to
set.
me is
Well,
logical
why
incoherence.
would it be? Well, then why would it? So you're saying that's, first of all, that's not a contradiction, because that's not that you haven't put it in a conjunction of two inconsistent propositions.
Sure,
But why is it logically necessary that for the set of all contingent existences there would have to be an external input, right? And what I mean by logically necessary is that the proposition in question would have to be true in all logically possible worlds, in which if I were to negate the proposition, it would violate the axioms of classical logic. It would contain a contradiction, right? But again,
sure.
just
So what
positing that there would have to
I
be an
don't dis
external input is just to reassert the claim.
yes, so I don't disagree with the fact that you could have an infinite chain. Sure, you could have an infinite chain. My problem is when you say that one individual member of a chain is dependent. It's dependent on something. You would agree to that, right? Or you're saying that there is, because firstly you were making this argument that the first member is independent and that started the chain. Now you're making the case that there is a set which has
Wait, wait, Polka, but wait, because you say so many things that I just can't like contain myself to not
sure,
just like jump in.
sure,
So
Dart, give me two seconds,
your
just give me two
problem,
seconds.
you're saying that you don't have a problem with an infinite chain of dependencies. Okay, then why employ this argument?
I'll
If
tell
there you
you
have
why.
no
I'll
problem with
tell
an
you why.
infinite chain of dependencies,
I'll tell you why.
then you
Because
wouldn't
an
need to
infinite
posit
an
a necessary
Sure,
being.
sure, sure. I'll tell you why. Because an infinite chain of dependencies would require an outside cause. If there is no outside cause, then the infinite chain of dependencies cannot logically exist because each member of the set has to have a dependency. There has to be an
See,
outside cause.
but Polka, when you say there has to be an outside cause and it's necessitated by a necessary being, that has to come from, and the necessary part, I just take it to mean, can be denoted almost in a way that's semantically equivalent, right? You're just saying the same thing but in different words. You're not actually providing a case for why it has to come, right, from an
No,
external
I'm
source.
telling you an evidence because each individual member is dependent on something,
Yeah,
right?
but the set,
Now, you can have an infinite chain of dependencies with an outside cause. To say that you are having an infinite chain of
Sorry.
dependencies without an outside
Wait. But
cause
the
is
way I'm
illogical.
using wait. But when I say that it's infinite, presumably it's not going to somehow, in this case, come to existence from anywhere, or that just to even invoke the word "come from," right? When it's an infinite regress of dependencies, just is just incoherent, right? If it's infinite, why would you need to posit the existence of an external source to explain all the
Because,
contingent realities?
yeah,
Are you
I'll tell you
saying
why.
you have no
Because
problem in saying, wait, I
yeah,
just
yeah,
want to
I
understand
have
your
no,
position.
I would have no problem with infinite regress. I mean, I do have problem, but I'll not use those the issues over here because it would get complex. What I'm trying to say over here is, and we can agree to disagree. What I'm trying to say over here is, in a set, if you have a member which is dependent, it and the chain is infinite, that has to have an outside cause. Otherwise, it would just be illogical to assume that a chain of dependent
I
contingencies
mean,
are
this is
existing are existing without any outside cause. It would be just illogical to assume that. And I'll tell you why. Because each individual member, the thing is, we have to kind of take into account that each individual member has a dependency. Now, that dependency can only be covered through an outside absolute existence. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Please just
but
agree to
only
disagree.
just to say that
So many
only yeah,
loaded
but
terms.
you realize what I'm trying to say here when you say that each individual member would have to have its necessary and sufficient conditions satisfied by each prior dependent member, and that in order to establish the conditions aggregately there has to be a necessary source,
Exactly.
has to be okay. If you say exactly, then you agree with me when I say, when you say has to be and is necessitated by an independent source, those would just be denoted as meaning the same thing. You haven't established an argument. When every time you're asked to give an argument, you just repeat that it's just logically incoherent.
No, no, no.
Right? So I
Yeah,
don't
and
know
that's the
where
argument
else to
I'm
go with
presenting.
this.
Yeah, I
Polka,
think we
I'll
can
give you an
agree to
example.
disagree.
I gave
Sure.
the energy concept as a scientifically proven or demonstrated to the best we can concept of coming from you could say a first cause, but it's a constant, it's a concrete, hard fact that there is energy and you cannot destroy it. And the fundamental particles vibrate in that energy. So that is
So for
can
Michael, for me
so
to
you know what I'm
address
getting.
that, yeah, I understand. Basically, you're saying that why can't energy be the fundamental cause which could lead to all contingent existences? The problem is energy cannot exist outside the universe. So the
Well,
thing is, if
how did you come to
sure,
that understanding?
Well, why would it have to?
so
What does it even mean to say outside of the
I don't.
universe?
I don't know.
Outside is a
I'll
spatial term. I don't know what it would
Yeah,
mean to
outside
apply
is a
that
spatial
term
term. Do you
so
mean
basically, what
side
I'm trying to tell
with
you is, did
without?
energy exist prior to singularity or prior to the Big Bang?
Yeah,
T
but
minus one.
Actually,
outside, yeah, but
technically,
look,
yes.
buddy.
It was
So
called inflation.
energy is a dependent contingency of the landscape of the universe, and
Hold on,
universe.
hold on. When you say universe, you're talking T plus one or T, because there could be a T minus one. It could be a different type of universe that was
Yeah,
before,
sure,
which then
That would still
collapsed.
be the universe.
Well, yeah,
sure, sure,
it could be the sorry. Let's say the cosmos, because let's just say all
Yeah, fine.
multiverses. Universe being the one we know of today,
sure,
the one that we're aware of. That okay. So cosmos, it could be the fundamental property of the cosmos.
sure. I agree. The issue that I'm having over here is that how did the cosmos come into existence without an
What do you
outside
mean when you
existence?
say that? When you say
Well,
come
well,
into
when you
existence, what
say,
are you
look,
trying
but
to
when you
say?
invoke things like outside of the universe, outside is still a spatial notion, right? At least to me, it is a spatial notion,
So
right?
so
Even in these
basically,
terms,
do
like
you do,
beginning to exist is going to be a temporal notion, right?
And
So
to everybody else.
it's just like maybe there is a language barrier. Like I don't
I'm
know.
not
I
a
don't.
native
I
I mean,
think
English
I
speaker, so
suspect.
I apologize if I confused anyone. The point I'm
I
trying
don't
to
think that's the problem.
no, I don't think that's the problem either. I think the problem is
What?
twofold. Number one, I think Polka keeps conflating contingency and dependency, and I
Yeah, he's
don't
using
think
an
those terms mean the same
idiosyncratic.
thing. And then number two, he keeps using this come into existence, come from language
Game over.